cold cases in Volusia County could be cracked soon. We told you last week the county's medical examiner just got a big grant from the state to conduct genetic research.
And hopefully get some answers. The examiner team today to find out how they'll choose the cases for this.
Sometimes history isn't buried in the ground, it's written in our blood. In Montana, a man named Darrell "Dusty" Crawford took a DNA test expecting answers about his family. Instead, scientists found a lineage older than any they'd ever traced in the Americas. Evidence that could redraw the map of how the first people reached this continent. His genes carried not just ancestry, but a story as old as the land itself. The accidental discovery. For Darrell "Dusty" Crawford, it started as a small act of curiosity. Living in the rolling plains of Montana, among the wide skies and windswept hills that have always belonged to his people, he wanted to understand where he fit into the long human story. His family spoke often about their Blackfeet heritage, their ancestors, their pride, their survival. But like many modern Native Americans, Crawford wondered what science could add to what tradition had already taught. So one day, he ordered a DNA kit, just a small box with a plastic tube and an instruction sheet. He filled it, sealed it, and mailed it off to a lab run by CRI Genetics, a company known for its ancestry and migration analysis. He didn't think much of it afterward. A few weeks later, an email arrived, the kind you might skim past on a busy day. But this one would change everything. When Crawford opened his report, he expected the usual mix of numbers and percentages. Instead, he found something that scientists at CRI Genetics themselves called historic. His DNA traced back not hundreds, but thousands of generations to a maternal lineage older than any they had ever seen in the Americas. In genetic terms, it belonged to a rare branch of the B2 haplogroup, one that could be directly linked to some of the first people ever to step foot on the continent. For a moment, Crawford thought it had to be a mistake. How could a man from a small Montana town hold something so ancient inside him? But when the researchers double-checked, the results held steady. His genetic map stretched back approximately 17,000 years, older than the famous Clovis culture, which had long been thought to represent the first humans in North America. To the scientists, this was astonishing. To Crawford, it was humbling. The discovery placed his lineage deep within prehistory, at a time when the Earth was still locked in the tail end of the Ice Age. Much of the world's water was frozen in glaciers. Mammoths and giant sloths roamed the northern plains. Humans were only beginning to find pathways into new lands. Somewhere in that frozen world, Crawford's ancient ancestors made a journey, one that would eventually lead to the high plateaus of Montana, thousands of years before Columbus, before maps, before history even had a name. The researchers at CRI Genetics shared their findings publicly in 2019, calling Crawford's results the oldest Native American DNA we've ever tested. The news spread quickly, appearing in USA Today, the Great Falls Tribune, and other outlets. The story captivated people because it felt almost mythic, a man discovering that his bloodline carried a map to the dawn of American civilization. But behind the headlines lay something even deeper, a bridge between science and identity. When journalists asked Crawford what the discovery meant to him, his answer wasn't about fame or science. "It's not just my story," he said. "It's the story of my people." He spoke about how his ancestors survived ice, hunger, and isolation, and how his DNA was proof that they'd endured through everything. For him, the results didn't replace oral tradition. They reinforced it. But for scientists, the implications went far beyond personal heritage. Crawford's genetic markers offered rare clues about migration patterns, climate shifts, and the timing of the first human settlements in North America. For decades, archaeologists had debated when and how the first people arrived. Did they cross a land bridge from Siberia? Did they travel by sea along the Pacific coast? Crawford's DNA, combined with other ancient genetic samples like those from the 12,600-year-old Anzac child, also discovered in Montana, seemed to suggest that multiple groups may have entered the continent far earlier, perhaps before the ice sheets even melted. It was as if every strand of Crawford's DNA carried a whisper from that ancient crossing, evidence that the story of the first Americans was far more complex, diverse, and interconnected than textbooks had long claimed. Back in his hometown, though, life didn't change overnight. Crawford continued his days as he always had, surrounded by family, community, and the land his ancestors once walked. But there was a quiet pride in knowing that somewhere in a lab, his blood had helped redraw the map of human history. What made the discovery truly powerful wasn't just the science. It was the reminder that history doesn't only live in ruins or fossils. Sometimes it lives inside us, hidden in the silent code that connects every generation to the last. For the Blackfeet people, whose stories stretch across the plains for countless generations, Crawford's DNA test felt like a scientific echo of their oral traditions, proof that they had indeed been here since time immemorial, as their elders often said. It's easy to imagine his ancestors long ago, standing on those same Montana plains, watching the horizon as the glaciers retreated. They couldn't have known that their descendants would one day carry their story inside their blood. Yet somehow, that story survived, written not in ink or stone, but in the spiral of a gene. And now, centuries later, it had been found again. What scientists found hidden in those ancient genes would raise even bigger questions about how the first Americans truly arrived. The DNA code. When news broke that Darrell "Dusty" Crawford carried the oldest Native American DNA ever tested, the headlines made it sound almost supernatural, as if his genes had been preserved in amber for thousands of years. But what did that actually mean? To understand it, you have to look at how scientists read DNA, and how a single strand can tell the story of an entire people. Every human carries a record of their ancestors in their genetic code, a biological diary written over tens of thousands of years. Deep inside each cell, tiny bits of DNA pass from generation to generation, usually unchanged. These bits form what scientists call haplogroups, family branches that can trace where someone's maternal or paternal ancestors lived and migrated. In Crawford's case, his maternal DNA belongs to a rare line called B2, one of the 4 major haplogroups that mark the earliest indigenous peoples of the Americas. Most modern Native Americans belong to haplogroups A, B, C, D, or X, each representing a different migration wave or ancient population. The B line is especially interesting because it seems to have followed the Pacific coast from Asia into the Americas rather than crossing inland through ice corridors. That small distinction tells an enormous story. It suggests that while glaciers still block the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, some groups may have traveled by sea, hugging the shoreline and slowly making their way south, hunting, gathering, and adapting as they went. The descendants of those travelers eventually reached places like California, Central America, and yes, Montana. Crawford's DNA, with its ancient B2 signature, seems to preserve evidence of that coastal journey. It's like holding a fossil, except this one lives inside a person. What made his case extraordinary wasn't just the haplogroup itself, it was how far back it reached. The lab's calculations dated his lineage to around 17,000 years ago, a time when mammoths roamed the plains and most of North America was still covered in ice. For years, scientists believed humans only arrived around 13,000 years ago, tied to the famous Clovis culture, known for its distinct stone tools. But Crawford's DNA pointed to something earlier. People who were here before Clovis, long before recorded history even began. This aligned with other discoveries that had already begun to shake the old timeline. Archaeologists had found human footprints in New Mexico dated to about 23,000 years ago, and tools in Chile from as early as 18,500 years ago. The more evidence piled up, the clearer it became that the story of human arrival in the Americas wasn't a straight line. It was a web of journeys spread across centuries and coasts. In that sense, Crawford's DNA wasn't just about one man's ancestry. It was a piece of a much larger puzzle. His results gave weight to the idea that multiple waves of migration brought people into the Americas, some by land and others by sea, each leaving their genetic footprints behind. Still, scientists approached the claim with cautious excitement. Commercial DNA companies like CRI Genetics use proprietary algorithms, and their findings aren't always peer-reviewed like academic studies. But even if the exact number, 17,000 years, wasn't precise, the broader picture it painted held up. Crawford's lineage was incredibly ancient, connecting him directly to the earliest known inhabitants of the continent. For the Blackfeet Nation, that science matched something they already knew in their hearts. Their oral histories say their people have always been here, that they came from the land itself, not from across an ocean. When Crawford's results went public, many in his community saw it not as a revelation, but as a confirmation. "It just proves what our stories have always said," one elder remarked in a local interview. "We didn't come from somewhere else. We've been here since the beginning." This cultural perspective added a deeper meaning to the science. Where geneticists saw migrations and haplogroups, the Blackfeet saw ancestry and belonging. Crawford's DNA test became a bridge between two ways of knowing, one written in data, the other spoken through generations. Meanwhile, genetic researchers across the country took note. If a modern man in Montana carried a lineage that ancient, what did that say about other untested populations across the continent? How many other living fossils might still exist, carrying fragments of prehistory inside their cells? The implications reached beyond North America, too. The B2 haplogroup connects not only to ancient peoples in the Americas, but also to early populations in Siberia, Japan, and even Polynesia, suggesting that the story of human expansion wasn't just about migration, but about adaptation. Humans didn't just survive the Ice Age, they thrived through it, moving, learning, and passing their knowledge down through time. For scientists, discoveries like Crawford's act as guideposts. They show that history isn't fixed, it's alive, constantly shifting as new data emerges. And for people like Crawford, they offer something more personal, a tangible link between ancient ancestors and modern identity. If you strip away the technical language, what his DNA really says is simple. We've been here a long, long time. And yet, this discovery only deepened the mystery. If Crawford's lineage stretched back that far, what did it say about the journeys his ancestors took to get here? Where did they start? How did they survive the freezing world of the Ice Age? If Dusty Crawford's DNA could reach back 17,000 years, then the real mystery wasn't who he was. It was how his ancestors got here in the first place, tracing the first Americans. For generations, the story of how humans first reached the Americas seemed straightforward. Ancient hunters from Siberia crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the last Ice Age, around 13,000 years ago. They followed herds of mammoths and bison into a frozen wilderness, eventually spreading south through an ice-free corridor that opened between glaciers. It was a neat, tidy theory, one that fit the evidence of stone tools and bones found across North America. But like most stories passed down through time, it was only part of the truth. Dusty Crawford's DNA cracked that story open. His genetic profile revealed something startling: lineages that predate the traditional Clovis first model by thousands of years. His mitochondrial DNA, specifically the haplogroup D4H3A, connects him directly to some of the oldest remains found along the Pacific coast of the Americas. In other words, his ancestors didn't just walk here. They sailed, paddled, and migrated along the shoreline of an ancient world that looked very different from today's. The DNA evidence points toward what scientists now call the Kelp Highway hypothesis. This theory suggests that the first Americans may have traveled by sea, following the rich kelp forests that lined the Pacific Rim. These waters were teeming with fish, shellfish, and sea mammals, providing a stable food source during the harsh Ice Age. It's a vision of human migration, not of desperate survival across a frozen bridge, but of skilled seafarers exploring an uncharted coastline. The implications are enormous. If the first Americans arrived earlier and by sea, it reshapes our understanding of human adaptability. These early people weren't just wanderers. They were navigators, innovators, and explorers on a grand scale. Crawford's DNA offers a living link to those ancient voyagers, a biological thread stretching across millennia, connecting the icy edges of Siberia to the warm shores of the Americas. But it's not just about genetics. Archaeology has started to catch up with what DNA has been hinting at. Sites like Monteverde in Chile, dating back nearly 15,000 years, show evidence of human life long before the supposed opening of the ice-free corridor. Other coastal sites in California and Alaska reveal signs of early settlements, charred hearths, stone tools, and remnants of boats or fishing gear, supporting the idea of a maritime migration. In one particularly intriguing find, scientists unearthed footprints on the shores of what is now White Sands National Park in New Mexico. Radiocarbon dating placed them at over 21,000 years old, thousands of years before the Ice Age began to retreat. If those dates hold true, it would mean humans were already thriving in North America long before the traditional timeline even began. Crawford's DNA doesn't just confirm these findings, it gives them a face, a family, and a story. It ties the modern to the ancient, showing that the bloodlines of the first Americans didn't vanish. They endured, woven into the people who still live across the continent today. For indigenous communities, this isn't merely a scientific revelation, it's validation. Their oral histories have long spoken of ancient migrations and origins far older than Western science once acknowledged. In fact, Crawford himself described the discovery as deeply spiritual. He said it felt as though the ancestors had been waiting for their story to be told not through textbooks or lectures, but through living proof that their lineage never disappeared. His DNA, he said, brought their voices back. As scientists continue to study his genome, new questions emerge. If ancient humans arrived along the Pacific coast, how far did they travel? How did they adapt to such diverse climates, from the icy north to the deserts of the southwest? And what other secrets might still be hidden in the DNA of modern native populations, waiting to rewrite the next chapter of human history? The beauty of this discovery lies in its complexity. It's not a single revelation, but a mosaic. Genetics, archaeology, anthropology, and oral history coming together to reveal a richer, more human story of how people first called this land home. Crawford's DNA doesn't close the book on the mystery of the first Americans. It opens it wider, inviting us to look beyond the old maps and assumptions. And as each new piece of evidence emerges, a footprint, a fragment of bone, a strand of ancient DNA, one thing becomes clear. The story of human arrival in the Americas is far older, bolder, and more connected than anyone dared imagine. But even with these discoveries, one question still lingers. How did science finally prove that Crawford's DNA truly carried the oldest lineage in America? The answer would come from a lab thousands of miles away, where cutting-edge technology met the whispers of the ancient past. One DNA test and modern anthropology. When scientists at CRI Genetics finished analyzing Dusty Crawford's DNA, they didn't just find something old, they found something impossible to ignore. His mitochondrial DNA, traced through his mother's line, was the oldest living genetic signature ever identified in the Americas. But what stunned researchers wasn't just the age of his genes, it was what that age meant. It forced scientists to reconsider the timeline of human migration into North America, and more importantly, to rethink who should be telling that story. In the scientific world, every discovery has a ripple effect. Crawford's results sent waves through anthropology departments, museum archives, and even classrooms. For over a century, textbooks had taught that the first humans arrived in the Americas about 13,000 years ago via the Bering Land Bridge, a frozen passage from Siberia to Alaska. These early settlers were said to be the Clovis people, famous for their distinctive spear points and hunting tools. But Crawford's DNA didn't match that neat timeline. His genetic markers predated the Clovis era by nearly 4,000 years. That might not sound like much, but in archaeology, that's the difference between rewriting a paragraph and rewriting an entire chapter. If Crawford's DNA lineage truly stretched back 17,000 years, then the Americas had been populated long before the Clovis migration, perhaps by entirely different groups following different paths. The shock was immediate. Scientists began revisiting old data, re-examining fossil records, and cross-referencing indigenous oral histories. Suddenly, sites that had once been dismissed as too early for human habitation started to look more credible. Ancient footprints in New Mexico, stone tools in Texas, even genetic traces from remains in South America. All of it began to fit a much older, much more complex story than anyone had dared to write before. And then there was the cultural impact. For indigenous communities, Crawford's discovery wasn't a revelation, it was a validation. Generations of native elders had long told stories of their people being here since time began. For centuries, Western science had brushed those claims aside as myth or metaphor. Now, hard genetic evidence was beginning to align with those oral traditions. Dr. James Watson of the University of Arizona, not the DNA co-discoverer, but an anthropologist of the same name, commented that discoveries like Crawford's bridge the gap between science and story. He added, "We've always looked at oral histories as poetic retellings, but we're learning they may be just as accurate, only told in a different language." Inside the labs, scientists approached Crawford's DNA with both excitement and caution. They double-checked for contamination, ran blind tests, and compared the data against ancient samples from Alaska, Mexico, and Chile. Each result came back consistent. Dusty's lineage, D4H3A, was among the oldest and uniquely preserved. The discovery sparked an even bigger question. If Crawford's family line had remained genetically pure for 17,000 years, what did that mean about the migrations that followed? Did this lineage represent one of the earliest waves into the Americas? One that survived while others vanished? Or could there have been multiple overlapping migrations from different directions, not just the Bering route, but perhaps across the Pacific itself? That idea that ancient humans might have reached the Americas by sea thousands of years before the Bering crossing had once been dismissed as far-fetched. But now, Crawford's DNA added a new layer of evidence. His maternal lineage was connected not only to ancient North American samples, but also to early coastal populations in Asia. Combined with recent archaeological finds along the Pacific Rim, that connection breathed new life into the coastal migration theory. Suddenly, the picture of how people first entered the New World looked far less like a single road and far more like a network of paths, some frozen, some floating. The discovery also reignited a long-running tension between Western scientific institutions and indigenous communities. Who gets to interpret these findings? Who owns the narrative of the first Americans? For many Native people, the answer was clear. They do. In interviews, Crawford himself emphasized that his DNA wasn't just data, it was heritage. "We already knew this," he told a local reporter. "Science is just catching up to what our stories have been saying forever." His calm confidence contrasted sharply with the media frenzy around him. Headlines spoke of rewriting prehistory and shocking genetic revelations, but Crawford's tone was grounded, even humble. Anthropologists, however, couldn't help but marvel. Dr. Jennifer Raff, a geneticist and author of Origin, A Genetic History of the Americas, noted that Crawford's results could help refine timelines for early population splits. "It's like finding a living fossil," she explained, "a rare surviving branch of a tree that started growing 17,000 years ago and is still alive today." The most fascinating part of this story is how it connects the smallest molecule to the largest questions of identity. A few strands of mitochondrial DNA, just a few thousand base pairs long, have the power to alter the way entire civilizations understand their beginnings. In museums, timelines have started to shift. In research papers, old assumptions are being re-examined. And in native classrooms across the country, children now hear a slightly different version of history, one that begins not with discovery, but with endurance. Dusty Crawford's DNA didn't just solve a puzzle. It reminded us that the story of the Americas isn't just about when people arrived, it's about who kept the story alive. But the DNA was just one part of the mystery. As researchers dug deeper, they began to uncover traces of ancient technologies and symbols, hints that these early Americans were far more advanced than anyone imagined. What if Dusty's genes weren't just old, but evidence of a civilization we've only begun to rediscover? Clues of an ancient civilization. When scientists talk about ancient civilizations in the Americas, most of the spotlight goes to the Maya, the Inca, or the mysterious builders of mounds and cities scattered across North America. But what if traces of something even older, a civilization that predates them all, are hiding in plain sight? That's the question Crawford's discovery quietly stirred. If his DNA lineage stretches back 17,000 years, then his ancestors weren't just early travelers. They might have been founders, the builders of traditions, technologies, and networks that shaped the Americas before recorded history ever began. To understand this, scientists began looking beyond genetics, toward archaeology, anthropology, and even oral tradition. In Montana, near where Crawford's family has lived for generations, archaeologists revisited ancient sites once thought to be ordinary. Suddenly, patterns emerged. Stone tools older than expected, pigments and carvings that hinted at symbolic thinking, even burial sites showing social structure and ritual. None of it looked random. These were signs of a people who didn't just survive, they organized, adapted, and remembered. One site in particular, the Anzac site in western Montana, caught researchers' attention. It's home to the oldest known burial in North America. A child laid to rest nearly 13,000 years ago, surrounded by ochre and finely crafted tools. The DNA from that child shares links with Crawford's genetic group, Though thousands of years separate them, both lineages carry echoes of the same ancient migration and perhaps the same beliefs about life and death. It's not proof of a lost empire, but it's a reminder that the people who first walked these lands were not primitive wanderers. They were explorers, artists, storytellers, humans with dreams, fears, and families. They built communities, passed down skills, and left behind clues for us to find in stone, bone, and gene. Even more intriguing are the artifacts scattered along the Pacific coast, tools and shell ornaments found deep in caves and under ancient beaches. These sites suggest that early Americans traveled by sea, living off the ocean's bounty long before agriculture took root inland. Some archaeologists even believe that a network of small coastal settlements may have stretched from Alaska to Chile, a kind of Ice Age highway for humans and ideas. That theory, once fringe, now aligns with what Crawford's DNA implies, a genetic footprint that mirrors this coastal route. It's as if his very cells remember the sound of the ocean that carried his ancestors to the New World. But there's another layer, one that connects science to story in a way only human history can. Indigenous oral traditions across North America speak of ancient arrivals not as migrations, but as emergences. Moments when people came forth from the earth, guided by spirits or ancestors. For centuries, Western scholars dismissed these as myth. Yet now, genetics is offering something extraordinary, evidence that these emergences may correspond to real, deep-time events. The re-peopling of the continent after the last ice age, as glaciers melted and the land awakened again. What Crawford's DNA does, perhaps more powerfully than any carbon-dated artifact, is restore continuity to those stories. It bridges the gap between data and identity, between ancient science and living tradition. It tells us that the people who stood here 17,000 years ago didn't vanish. They are still here, breathing the same air, standing on the same ground. Their descendants carry that unbroken chain inside them, even if most of the world forgot to look. That realization is reshaping how archaeologists and geneticists collaborate with indigenous communities. Instead of studying the past from a distance, many researchers are now working side by side with tribal historians, elders, and storytellers, treating DNA as a tool of remembrance, not ownership. Crawford's case is often cited as an example of how science can honor, rather than overwrite, indigenous knowledge. It's not about discovering the first Americans, it's about finally listening to them. Even outside academia, his story has struck a chord. In museums and classrooms, children now learn that their country's first chapter is not just a tale of migration, but of endurance and adaptation. In a world that often divides people by borders and ancestry, Crawford's DNA offers something universal, proof that every person carries a fragment of history that belongs to everyone. It's humbling to think about. One man's decision to swab his cheek for a DNA test ended up stretching a thread across millennia, from the frozen coasts of Asia to the sunlit plains of Montana. That thread connects science to soul, genetics to geography, and humanity to time itself. And maybe that's the real discovery here. Not that the first Americans arrived earlier than we thought, or by a different route, but that they never really left. Their memory lives on, in language, in land, and in blood. For Dusty Crawford, the story isn't about rewriting history books. It's about remembering what was never truly forgotten. "We've always been here," he said. Simple words, yet they carry the weight of 17,000 years. Science, it seems, has finally caught up. Maybe the oldest DNA in America didn't just reveal our past, It reminded us who we've always been. Stay curious, hit subscribe, and let's keep uncovering the stories still written in our bones.